Hi, everyone. My name is Rajiv Ramchand. I'm an epidemiologist. When we first started learning that COVID-19 would have an impact on our lives, I thought one of the things that I could do was to provide information to my family and my colleagues about epidemiology, some of the basic concepts, so that they could help understand the news and learn more and be informed when hearing what our government officials tell us, what the media tells us, because we're really being bombarded with information. It went over really well. So I was encouraged to create these videos to share them with you. I have a series of 9 videos. Each is only around 10 to 15 minutes, going over some really basic epidemiologic concepts. It's not to create a new cadre of epidemiologists necessarily, though I would love if it garnered more appreciation of the field, but it's really just to help inform you during these times. And with that, let's get right into it on some of the basics of epidemiology. So first, I just want to talk about how disease spreads. What is epidemiology? This is the definition that I like to use, which is that epidemiology is the study of the distribution, determinants, and control of disease. What I've shown here on this index card is a definition of epidemiology that I found on an index card in my father's briefcase after he passed away, and I was doing some cleaning and housekeeping. So it touches my heart that he copied this definition down and carried it with him. This was after, of course, I had become an epidemiologist. There's different types of epidemiology, and there's different uses for epidemiology, 4 of which you can see here. I think a great beginning point is to look at what's called the historic epidemiologic triad. And this is based on information that I found from Penn State's website. It had really great introductory information about epidemiology. So this triad is really anchored in infectious disease epidemiology, and it posits that there's 3 key factors or key components to describe how infectious diseases spread. You have an agent, which is a microbe that causes the disease, and you could think of that as a virus or a bacteria. You have a host or an organism that harbors the disease, and you could think of that as an animal, perhaps, or a human. And then you have the environment. This is where your agent that causes the disease and the host that harbors the disease are brought together in the environment. So that's a very basic concept. Sometimes it's made a little bit more advanced, if you will, by considering vectors that actually convey infection from one host to another. And the most common example of that is a mosquito in the case of malaria that conveys infection from one host, from one human to another. In the case of COVID-19, what we have right now, the agent is the coronavirus. The host is humans. So far, we haven't seen that, my dog, for example, it doesn't seem like our dogs are getting the disease, even though they may have the infection. And then the environment, where the agent and host are brought together. The reason why I like thinking about epidemiology and starting at this point is because it really helps us think about all these different control measures we have in place and how they're all interacting and operating on different corners, if you will, of this triad. So, for example, we can intervene with the host, or us, ourselves. And that's what we're doing when we try to create vaccines. What we're doing is changing our bodies, getting our bodies antibody ready so that we're less susceptible to develop disease once infected. So we're changing our bodies, essentially. The environment is where the bulk of our intervention efforts are happening right now, especially with physical distancing or social distancing. What we're doing is really just trying to limit the opportunities for agents and hosts to meet, where the coronavirus and humans can meet. And that's why we're doing physical or social distancing. We're operating on the environmental corner. You could also think, though, of many different types of environmental interactions or interventions necessarily. So, for example, people in countries where malaria is present who sleep under a bed net, for example, there we're intervening with the environment. We're prohibiting or intervening and limiting the opportunity for agent and host to meet. We can also work directly on the agent itself. And if you think of antibiotics or antivirals that directly target the agent and create opportunities that either make the agent unable to reproduce or that kill the bacteria, if you will, or kill the virus, or create conditions within the host that are unhospitable to the virus or the bacteria or the microbe. And then finally, there's some really interesting, though admittedly controversial work looking at intervening with vectors. And so you'll hear about, for example, research underway on genetically modified mosquitoes that will help prevent the transmission of agents between hosts. This is called the chain of infection. I adapted it from the Centers of Disease Control website. And it's also a really good way of thinking about how we can better understand the disease and the transmission of the disease from one person to another. So you have reservoirs. These are humans, animals, or the environment. And that's where, if you think of the last example of the triad, it's the host. So it's where the virus exists perhaps for humans, but it can also exist in animals. And the most common example is rabies. Or it can be in the environment. So it's a reservoir, it's where the microbe or the agent is. There needs to be a portal of exit then. There needs to be a way for it to get out. So in the case of COVID-19, we have respiratory, we have coughing, we have sneezing, things of that nature that is the portal of exit essentially of the virus from the human. Then you have to have a mode of transmission. So there can be direct transmission and indirect transmission. Direct transmission is direct contact, so skin to skin, kissing, sexual behaviors when we're speaking very broadly about the transmission of infectious agents, or there can be droplet spread. And that's, as I said before, sneezing and coughing. For indirect transmission, we have airborne diseases, so things that are just kind of harbored in the environment that exist, that are alive in the air that we breathe, or perhaps, just in the environments and where we're located. Then we can think of indirect transmission being vehicle-borne, so these are diseases that are transmitted by food or by water, or vector-borne, and as we were talking about before, mosquitoes are the primary example. Then there needs to be a portal of entry that they enter into the susceptible host who's uninfected. And what's really important and why I like this chain of infection is that our susceptibility is based on so many things and it varies from person to person. So our genes make us more or less susceptible to certain diseases or to certain infections. We may have specific immunity. We may have been vaccinated from a disease. We may have been infected before and developed antibodies that limit the chance of our being susceptible or harboring the disease. And then there's non-specific factors. So we're just very different as humans. We have different respiratory functioning. Some of us may have smoked, some of us may not. We have different skin composition that's somewhat determined by genetics and somewhat determined by the environment and where we live and how much sun exposure we have. All these things can potentially make us more or less susceptible. COVID-19 is so new that we're really just trying to better understand what are those factors that make some people more susceptible once infected to get the disease and others not. And the last slide for this discussion today is labeling the spread of diseases. So there's 4 terms that are used very often, and these definitions come again from the Centers for Disease Control. An endemic is a disease that's present at all times. So the common cold is an example. You just always see it in society. It may follow a seasonal pattern, but it's kind of endemic to the community. There's a cluster, and that's a group of cases in a specific time and place. So we're not talking about the rate or the proportion, which we'll get into in the next session, but we're just seeing an influx of the number of people who have developed symptoms or have been diagnosed with a specific disease. An epidemic or outbreak is where we actually have some validation that what we've seen, this cluster that we've seen, exceeds what we would have expected in that community, in that place and time. So we've moved from cases, we've incorporated kind of a denominator or a comparison group in saying, and are able to definitively say that this is exceeding what is expected. And then finally, a pandemic is what everyone's talking about, COVID-19 right now, and that's an epidemic that crosses regional boundaries. Some people equate pandemic to assuming that it's global. I tend to use the term global pandemic, so I use global as an adjective just to reaffirm that I'm talking about something that's globally spread and that's cross global boundaries. So the next session, we're going to be talking about quantifying disease spread. I hope you found this informational. I hope you'll join me for the next sessions. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay informed. Thanks.